Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to Dismantling Injustice, the podcast of Brooklyn Community Bail Fund. At BCBF, we work to free people from incarceration, prison, jail, detention, surveillance. And on this podcast, we offer analysis on issues affecting folks who encounter the criminal, legal, and immigration systems. I'm Carl Hamad-Lipscombe, BCBF's Director of Advocacy and Policy. I'm here with Saleh Israel, BCBF's Director of Special Initiatives. And, at BCBF, for those that have been listening to our podcast for the past few weeks or that know us, because you get our newsletter or you follow us on social media, you know that we don't hide the fact that we don't believe in the concept of incarceration. We don't believe in imprisonment, whatever you want to call it. For us, people don't belong in cages. And we know that many of you share this view, or you would share this view if you knew of an alternative. We get a lot of questions from folks about what does it mean to be an abolitionist. So we thought that we'd have we'd have this conversation today. We do a sort of abolitionism 101 episode for you. I have the pleasure of being joined by our colleague Angel Parker, who leads the Court Watch program at BCBF, and maybe even more importantly, has been involved with abolitionist movements for years, starting in college and possibly before, and that includes her work with Survived and Punished, which I know she's going to talk more about today. Hey, Angel.
Hi, Carl and Sally. Very, very excited to be here, and thank you for the introduction.
Of course, and we thought it'd be good to have you on the podcast. One, because you gave an amazing training on Court Watch last week, and a big part of that training was on abolitionism and what does it mean to be an abolitionist, and how do you work toward prosecutorial accountability as an abolitionist. And this is sort of self-serving because I didn't get to attend that training, and so I want to be able to hear from you. But also, we just thought it was important for the broader BCBF community to hear about abolitionism and to hear the way that you talk about it. So I guess my first question for you is, what is abolitionism?
Definitely. Abolition, for those who are unfamiliar, is, as Carl was describing, really the fight to completely dismantle the prison industrial complex. And it is a nod to slavery abolition and the fight to abolish slavery specifically in the 19th century. So I do want to make that connection. But we definitely see abolition, and this is a definition that has been used by Critical Resistance and Project NEA and people across kind of the organizing movement, is abolition is both a long-term goal and an organizing strategy. So a long-term goal in the sense that, like I said, we want to completely dismantle the prison industrial complex. That's prison, policing, detention centers, and all of that type of stuff, so that we don't necessarily support things in the long term that expand the prison system or expand the court system. But also, abolition as an organizing strategy means that more in the immediate sense, we want to try to shrink the size and the scope of the prison industrial complex. So, we oppose new jails. We oppose laws that criminalize more behaviors and more things. And so, it is an acknowledgement, right, that the prison industrial complex was designed to enslave and marginalize people. And because at the time that it was created, these things were not necessarily bad things to say. There are historical accounts of people saying that, yeah, we're doing this to re-enslave people. And more than dismantling, abolition is also about building, and it's about building the world that we want to see, building out our communities, building out our own power. And especially what I love about abolition is that it addresses the hard questions that people don't necessarily think to ask. Like, what does accountability look like? What is real justice outside of cages and outside of prosecution?
Thanks, Angel. And, you provided the perfect segue because, what is the alternative? What's the alternative to incarceration? What does accountability look like? Because I think, that's a question that, for many immediately comes to mind.
Definitely. And I think that's also a very common question that's asked of abolitionists. And I was recently listening to a talk of Miriam Kaba, and I know that Angela Davis says this a lot too, but that asking for the alternative is not the right question, right? Because we're not looking for a different place to put all of the quote-unquote bad guys, right? Abolition requires us to have a way more nuanced perspective because in our world, we all cause harm, right? We all are on the receiving end of harm. We all know people who have caused harm to varying degrees. And abolition kind of allows for that nuance, right? We don't necessarily support an alternative that is forcible or wrapped up in this system because a lot of those alternatives only expand the system. For example, ankle monitors or e-shackles, are meant to be looked at as an alternative. But I was just watching a panel with some folks from the Chicago Community Bond Fund that were saying their system was saying, okay, we'll release people for COVID on these ankle monitors. And in the end, it turns out now there are more people on ankle monitors than there even were that were incarcerated. So abolition doesn't necessarily seek an alternative to cages. When people make mistakes or even when people intentionally cause harm to someone else, what can we do instead as a community to support the survivor without creating more harm, right? How can we meet the material needs of the person that was harmed without torturing, caging, and isolating people and causing even more harm?
Mm-hmm. So, and this is another common question that we hear, and I know I heard this a lot last year when the question about defunding police departments came up. And that is what do you say to people who are concerned about public safety? What is it, don't you? And obviously I'm playing devil's advocate here. I can feel the horns coming out of my ears. But what do you say to people that are if we get rid of the police, it's not going to be safe. If we get rid of prisons, it's not going to be safe.
Yeah, and I think that is a real legitimate concern. People definitely are concerned with public safety. But the uncomfortable truth is that the system does nothing to address public safety, right? This system only comes in after something has already happened. And what abolition does is force us to think about how can we even prevent these from happening in the first place, right? In addition, this system is often used to enact harm, right? I think about someone like R. Kelly, right, who threatens his victims with calling the police on them. I will call the police on you and tell them that you were doing this too if you tell on me, right? Or people who threaten undocumented folks with, I'm going to call ICE if you do X, Y, Z. So oftentimes these systems are used to enact harm, not even to prevent the harm, nor to hold folks accountable for enacting the harm. And I think that there's also, on the other hand, when it comes to public safety, there's plenty of research out there that says that it's really wealth inequality and lack of community that leads to a lot of violence. So I think abolition forces us to ask, what about the state, right? What about the government's responsibility to ensure public safety? We hold individuals, and very specific individuals, right? Because it's not all individuals. We hold very specific types of individuals to draconian standards, and yet the government is completely off the hook for the harm that they cause in the ways that they actively deny us safety, right? They actively deny us health care when we have the money for it. They give us poisoned water sources in places like Flint. They build chemical plants by our neighborhoods. They intentionally and unnecessarily drown us in debt, and they allow pharmaceutical companies to bring drugs into our communities. So at what point does public safety address these things on a more macro level, because we're so forced to look at things from an individualistic standpoint. I think there's that saying that you missed the moon trying to count all the stars. We're missing the point here. That is, the state creates an environment that is not safe, and then they pick out very specific types of individuals to quote unquote hold them accountable for the harm that the state is creating the environment and cooking up, right? So we're trained to believe that this level of violence and suffering and fear and anxiety is inevitable, but that's not really the case. And I think the amazing thing about abolition is that abolition is wanting to create a world where this level of violence isn't even happening in the first place.
Yeah, in my previous job, we paid a lot of attention to all the research on like criminal legal reform and research on policing and corrections and whatnot. And, the work was really focused on this idea of evidence-based policy. But the thing that stood out to me is that there is absolutely no evidence that what we've been doing has been working, like that policing makes us safe, that incarceration leads to rehabilitation, or that it even supports the needs of victims. And so for me, like for all the focus that elected officials put on investing money in policies that work, I just always wonder, like, so why are we investing in this, in these systems that we've, been implementing for the last 100 years and have been shown to be just really an abject failure, rather than investing in new ideas, like investing in ideas that are community driven, to give those a try, because if what we're doing isn't working, like we can only spend so much money showing that. But you started to get into this, but one thing I wanted to talk about, and I know you've done a lot of work around this, is are the victims, like the victims of violence, the victims of harm, victims of trauma, shouldn't we be concerned about their needs and wishes, and to what extent does the current model either support them or not support them?
Definitely, absolutely. And I love that you brought this up, because I do feel like this is something that's important that some people shy away from in these conversations. But one thing that I love to point out is that abolition, kind of as we know it in this more modern sense, has been really refined and developed by survivors of violence. And abolition is something that comes out of Black and Indigenous communities who have survived centuries of violence. And so I think another thing is that, again, the uncomfortable truth is that survivors don't utilize this system, right? Like sexual violence and domestic violence are vastly underreported, right? The police account for a large portion of gun violence. So what about survivors of police violence? And even if you look at murder clearance rates at a lot of these police departments, they're completely abysmal, right? Like victims and survivors are actually not getting much out of this system at all. And abolition is not only concerned with meeting like the material needs of people who have been victimized, but also wants to do this while preventing more harm from happening. So to your point, Carl, right, like prisons, police, they have existed for the last 100+ years, and yet we are no closer to lessening harm and abuse than we were centuries ago. So abolition acknowledges survivorship on a large scale level, right? Like most people who are in the legal system are victims, and especially for someone like me who works with Survived and Punished and also was working as a domestic violence counsel on Rikers Island, there are a lot of survivors who are incarcerated and caged as a direct result of surviving violence. And so I think, somebody's individual want for revenge cannot take precedence over the wellness of an entire community, right? Like revenge is a fair emotion, an okay emotion to feel when someone has been harmed. But we have to sit with that, right? We have to sit with that feeling and really ask ourselves, how is torturing someone and separating them from their family going to actually mitigate this harm? This system creates victims, right? What happens to kids when their parents are taken away from them? What happens to families when they now have to spend all of this money going into debt, trying to give support for commissary, paying to go visit people, paying for, all of the costs that come along with these types of things? And again, to the point that I was making, the overwhelming majority of women in prisons and queer folks in prisons, and I'm talking like in the 90th percentile, are survivors of sexual and or domestic violence. So what do we do, right, with a society where the survivors are being locked up And yet, at the same time, the last two presidents and our current governor have all been accused of sexual violence, right? So which survivors are being centered in the conversations right now, and which survivors are being left out? And then we also have to ask ourselves, how is this system serving the needs of victims, right? The state does not offer time off of work to grieve or heal, let alone fair wages at these jobs. The state is not offering health care or trauma services. They're not offering housing. They're not offering community. When harm is caused, the state just essentially turns their back on the victim or survivor and spends all their resources trying to get the quote-unquote bad guy. So abolition is less concerned with punishing the bad guy, quote-unquote, right, and more concerned with addressing the conditions that caused the harm in the first place. And oftentimes, the system doesn't even adhere to the victim's wishes, right? People will say, I don't want an order of protection, or I don't want this. This person is the father of my children. I don't want them to be incarcerated. And yet, time and time again, the system paternalistically tells them, actually, I know what's best for you, so I'm going to step in and do this anyway.
Yeah, I can't count the number of times when I worked as a public defender where there was some sort of family dispute, often like between a child and a parent. And, people, especially where I grew up in the Bronx, people just call the police. It's sort of like they don't call the police with the intention of getting someone locked up. They, the city has promoted the police as like a solution to just day-to-day challenges, such that people, like, oftentimes the first intuition when there's like some sort of conflict is like, okay, like, why don't we call the police to simmer things down? Not realizing that once the criminal legal system gets involved, it becomes this big deal and they end up in court, and parents will say, no, we don't want an order of protection. Like, it's okay. Like, we want our child to come home, and, it's a no, like, because overzealous prosecutors or judges want to pursue it. And that's just how our system is set up. I only have a couple more questions for you, Angel. But what are some ways that folks campaign for abolition? I know, you mentioned you have been part of groups that have had abolition as being like their strategy, and they've like run campaigns around it. So just, what are some ways that folks campaign for abolition?
Yes, there's so many amazing organizations and campaigns fighting for abolition really across the country, let alone in New York City. Some of the ways is what we do at Court Watch, right? Calling out the prison industrial complex, or PIC actors, right? Going after prosecutors, going after judges, going after corrections officers, social workers, cops, corporations, even our governments, right? Our governments benefit vastly from these systems. There's also things like community bailouts, right? Like there a lot of COVID bailout campaigns and funds popped up during the pandemic, right? Even defense campaigns. There are things like pod mapping, right? Ways to strengthen your community. There's restorative justice. There's, restorative justice circles. There's transformative justice processes. I think we've seen a lot of very interesting ways that people have come up with alternatives to 911, right? Because when I was working with domestic violence survivors on Rikers Island, you would be surprised how many of the people that were there, they were the ones that called the police, and then they ended up arrested and charged. So what are alternatives to 911? There are campaigns, right? Campaigns against new jails, as I mentioned earlier, campaigns against jail alternatives. There's lots of campaigns against incarceration and shackles and things like that. Campaigns against criminalization, solitary confinement, and also, as I say, campaigns for, right, building our world, campaigns for elder relief, campaigns for clemency, for fair wages on the inside. There are people who, I know someone who worked hours a week on Rikers and made like $17 or something crazy like that. And then there's especially supporting people inside, letter writing, commissary funds, being able to support rides for people to go visit folks in these very isolated prisons in these upstate, supporting our political prisoners, right? People who put their lives on the line for our fight. And then more importantly, outside of the more very direct PIC organizing is the community building, because as I mentioned earlier, a lot of isolation and lack of community can be, is the cause of violence. So how do we build up our community so that people have places to go, people to support them, mutual aid, right? Running our own youth programming, community fridges and gardens, opening our homes to our neighbors and our family members. Things like that are very creative ways that people organize around abolition in ways that I have seen.
Wow, thank you so much, Angel. My next question was like, how can our listeners who see themselves as abolitionists get involved in the movement? Is there anything that you'd add there? You did give quite an exhaustive list, as part of your last answer, but is there anything that you tell people they should do immediately?
Definitely. I will say, and I think a lot of people have said this, but it cannot be said enough, studying abolition, right? So abolition is, I'm still learning things. Angela Davis, if you've ever seen her on a panel or something, will always say she wants to learn from other folks, even though we all want to hear from her. Studying this work and studying the history, right? Abolition comes out of Reconstruction. How we need to look back at what people have been doing across the last century and a half around these types of issues. And there are a lot of books that kind of expand on the things that I was mentioning before. And also joining organizations, right? I obviously can plug Court Watch here, but there are so many other organizations like Survived and Punished and RAP and Black and Pink and places like that. And also for folks who don't have capacity but have more money, donating, of course. Even something as easy on, how many GoFundMes there are of people raising money for bail and bail funds and donating to mutual aid funds and things like that. And I think lastly, and something that I think is very, very important, is learning of ways to practice abolition in your everyday life. Like, get to know your neighbors. If you all know each other, if there's a problem, you can speak to one another instead of feeling like 911 is your only option. Prioritizing community, right? Thinking of the ways that carceral, punitive logic shows up in our everyday lives. Because we have to not only learn abolition, but we have to, enact abolition in our everyday lives and our everyday relationships.
Well, thanks so much, Angel. I guess my last question is, and this is sort of me, just using this opportunity to tell all of our listeners how much of an avid reader you are, Angel. Angel reads something like 70 books a year. And so do you have any specific books or resources that you'd recommend for people that want to read about abolition?
Oh, man. I'm let me pull up my book list. I think the 101 one is, of course, Our Prisons Obsolete by Angela Davis. I would say I am always ranting and raving about Black Reconstruction by W.E.B. Du Bois. I'm actually reading a book right now called We Will Not Cancel Us and Other Dreams of Transformative Justice by Adrienne Marie Brown. So this has been interesting to read. Last week I finished, maybe 2 weeks ago, I don't remember anymore, I finished We Do This Till We Free Us by Mariam Kaba. There's, I think it's called Decarcerating Disability or something similar to that. I read that over the summer. And there's also another plug to the Court Watch website is we have an exhaustive list of abolitionist resources that I encourage people to look at. There's books on there, articles, podcasts, documentaries, and all types of stuff on there.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Angel, for taking time out of your day to join us. The last thing that, I just want to say for our listeners is that we are recording this podcast on March 24th. And this is, we're in the aftermath of shootings over the last couple of weeks in Atlanta and in Colorado. And, I wanted to talk about this now during this podcast because, abolition is also an anti-violence strategy. Abolition, at its root, is a fight against violence in the form of white supremacy, in the form of gender violence, in the form of violence against queer and trans communities, and also in the form of violence perpetrated by our government in the form of police and corrections and ICE, and in all of its forms. And so, I just want to just encourage everyone to really, really think about abolition and, check out the resources that Angel named, and visit our site if you, like to get more resources. Our heart goes out to those victims of those shootings that have taken place over the last couple of weeks. You are part of our fight for abolition. So thanks again, everyone. To learn more about BCBF, visit us at brooklynbailfund.org. You can follow us on all of the social media platforms. And until next time, until we're all free, peace out.